So we have a keynote speaker that comes to us from the finance world. We thought about bringing in a journalist. We went to Washington. I'm not saying nobody. We went to Washington, looked around, and felt like, wow, we're not going to bring them out to California. And so we went locally, and I had a buddy of mine that actually was in my office. He was looking at a real estate deal somewhere along Highway 4. And he just checked in. He's invited me to speak a couple of times on his panels. And I said, we're looking for a journalist. And he said, I actually write for Forbes. And then he said, .com. And I said, well, that counts. And so I want to introduce our keynote speaker. I think you'll really enjoy him. I've been on a couple panels with him. His name is Rudy Salo. Rudy is an infrastructure finance attorney at Nixon Peabody LLP in Los Angeles. He's a very passionate advocate for harnessing available technology to improve transportation infrastructure in order to make our commutes more tolerable, safer, and productive. And he actually takes transit from his house in Huntington Beach, or he tries to take transit from his house in Huntington Beach to his office in Los Angeles, but gets very frustrated doing that. So let's all welcome and hear a story, Rudy Salo. Thank you.
Hi, thanks everyone for showing up and attending. While I'm up here, I got to do a couple things. The first thing I got to do is apologize, because I learned yesterday who the other people that they were considering to come and be the keynote. And what I also have to do is thank somebody, that's Randy, for having the foresight to know before anyone in the world was going to know the coronavirus was going to happen. I think because Randy knew coronavirus was going to happen, that's why he asked me to come speak and not Maz Jobrani or somebody from the Obama administration, the other two people that were considering to come here, because I'm just a bond lawyer, and of course I'm not going to cancel on somebody like Randy. So, he's the smartest guy in the room. I must say that, and that's why you wound up with me. And who I am Rudy Salo. I do live in Los Angeles. I am a bond lawyer, but I'm more than that. I do take public transit, and that's primarily because my parents are immigrants. They come from Jordan. I heard there's going to be some Jordanians in the room. So, hi, how are you, my fellow brothers? And my grandmother lived with us as I grew up, and she didn't drive. She never got a driver's license when she immigrated here to the United States. She was old and she didn't know how to drive, so she got around everywhere in North Orange County back in the 70s and 80s via public transit. And she took me and my sister everywhere via public transit. So it was always instilled in us that you don't need a car. And so that's always been something that's been in my brain, and I've been very passionate about it. And I do primarily commute from Manhattan Beach to downtown LA via public transit, all the way up until the coronavirus happened. And now I'm hoping to get myself an autonomous vehicle and stay away from a bunch of other people. Just kidding. I do plan to continue to use public transportation and advocate for it. One of the primary reasons why is because of my day job. I am a municipal finance attorney. Who here knows what municipal bonds are? Okay, great. Some of you know what they are, and others of you do not. I could tell you that this is a very appropriate topic for what we're talking about today, because you cannot have a mobility future, you cannot have a future with any type of vehicle or train or anything without infrastructure. Infrastructure is the backbone to our entire society. I think that's pretty well known. But what's not really well known is how is infrastructure actually financed? Who's paying for the infrastructure? How do our roads get the money to get built? How do our transit systems get the money to get built? Why is that important? I think it's critical. I do believe that we need to rethink our infrastructure. We do need to rethink how we finance our infrastructure and how our citizens buy into that rethinking, because we need to think of new ways to finance. The ways that we have been financing our infrastructure have gotten us to where we're at today, which is perfectly fine. You know, you can look around the United States and we're one of the most advanced developed countries, but it's just not enough. And I will discuss this during this presentation. There have been some critical changes in our tax code, which are going to continue to limit the local government's ability to raise taxes to finance our infrastructure. And I'm very worried about my passionate place of birth, California, and I'll explain why. But what are we going to be talking about today? So I think I've explained why we're talking about infrastructure and transportation finance. We'll primarily be focused on California, though what we're going to be talking about is relevant for the entire United States. And what does our future hold? Are P3s, public-private partnerships, the sole solution? EIFDs, which are enhanced infrastructure financing districts, those came into being once the replacement of redevelopment agencies got taken away about eight or 9 years ago. And what other solutions can we come up with? What kind of user fees? What kind of buy-in can we get from private companies? That's one of the things I'm going to be advocating for and have been advocating for on my Forbes.com posts as well as on podcasts is we need private companies to understand that they need to buy into the reshaping of our infrastructure. They need to be open to ideas of sharing some of those mass amounts of revenues that they're receiving, because without it, you know, at the end of the day, we already have driverless cars. You can go onto YouTube and search driverless cars, and you can already see them. But we're not going to have the massive transformation of our society that I believe driverless cars and driverless technologies can produce without redoing our infrastructure. So we need to work hand in hand, private and public together. We'll talk about sales tax measures. I know that that's kind of a tough subject right now because of the loss that occurred last week. So, but unfortunately, I'm going to pour a little salt into that wound, and I'll explain what that actually means pretty soon. And we'll talk about the coronavirus and what kind of a long-term impact that's going to have on transportation, commuting, and our future. Okay, so why are we talking about infrastructure? Two primary reasons. Infrastructure in the United States it's at a critical point. California itself faces a 10-year, $765 billion infrastructure deficit, $500 billion of which is in transportation. Nationwide, the numbers in the trillions. Headlines. You turn on the news and you must have heard of the Flint water crisis. You've heard about collapsing bridges in Minnesota over the last couple of decades. That's one reason. The second reason is what I also mentioned. I firmly believe, and I've been saying this for 4 years, since 2016, when I really focused on driverless cars, and Randy and I first started doing panels together, I don't think we can tap into the mass amounts of benefits that driverless technology can have unless we redo our infrastructure. And how are we going to redo it if we don't know how to pay for it? What driverless technology is currently in place and being developed? We have vehicle-to-vehicle systems, vehicle-to-infrastructure technology. Vehicle-to-infrastructure systems connect cars and roadways. For example, if a bridge is unexpectedly shut down, it can alert drivers. Sensor reflectors and beacons added to existing signage are likely to enhance driverless technology, and all kinds of other types of equipment that is needed to be in our as a part of our infrastructure, not to mention a mass amount of 5G rollout in order for the connectivity to really happen. Do we need dedicated driverless car lanes? I think we do. I don't like the idea of having driverless cars in the same lanes as human drivers. I don't trust human drivers. That's one of the primary reasons why I take public transportation. And I'm sure there's going to be other types of infrastructure changes that is needed. But at the end of the day, how is that going to happen? How are we going to pay for it? How do we currently pay for our infrastructure in California and the United States? There are 3 basic ways that you pay for infrastructure. There's pay-as-you-go, which is basically the government will pay for a project out of out of its current revenues. That's a very difficult way to build the infrastructure that's needed because it's going to slow things down. Another way that you do it is you hire somebody like me and issue some muni bonds. There's all different types of municipal bonds. There's general obligation bonds, which are primarily paid for from property taxes, i.e. everyone in this room that owns a property, you're basically paying back those muni bonds through your property taxes. There's revenue bonds. There's lease revenue bonds and other types of bonds. We'll get into what lease revenue bonds are because that's very particular to California. The primary method of financing in California is by borrowing, and the primary method of borrowing is through the issuance of municipal bonds, or munis. Municipal governments that issue bonds receive a cash payment at the time of issuance in exchange for a promise to repay investors principal plus interest over time. Instead of a loan from a commercial bank, municipal bonds are sold out in the public markets to many investors. Although banks do and are involved in giving loans to governments, and a big portion of my practice is actually representing banks in their municipal lending. We'll talk a little bit more about the 2017 Tax Act, some of the changes in that, how it affected things. But when the corporate tax rate dropped from 35% to 21%, that actually affected the benefits for banks in making loans to municipal governments as well. So that has changed over the last 3 years, and we are moving more towards public market issuance again. That had changed for a little while as a result of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. So infrastructure, what do muni bonds finance? Everything, basically everything. Your airports, your ports, schools, utilities, stadiums, and roads. So we would not exist as a society if I didn't do what I do. If we did not have municipal bonds, we literally would have nothing that our daily lives have these days. So you're welcome. You're all welcome. The first municipal bond was issued in 1812 for the Erie Canal. Its success led to many other bonds. And in fact, it led to an explosion of railroad debt that ultimately resulted in economic crises in the late 1800s, followed by the Panic of 1873 and a whole bunch of defaults. And that led to state debt limits. Like one of the debt limits that we have here in California is called the constitutional debt limitation, which primarily limits a government's ability to issue debt unless they get a vote of the people. Now, think about that. As often as when you go to vote and you think there are, oh my gosh, there's a whole bunch of bonds on this measure, what are they doing? Governments actually issue a lot more debt than you even know about, and that's because genius bond lawyers and other people have figured out ways to recharacterize leases as not being debt under California law. And if we hadn't done that, then we would have many lacks. We would have a lack of infrastructure throughout our state, which we'll discuss a little bit more. How are municipal bonds issued? The issuer, like for example, the CCTA, will offer its bonds to investors through investment banks. Those are, J.P. Morgan, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, and those are also known as broker-dealers, and they manage the process. They make an offer to the issuer to buy the bonds at certain prices on a maturity basis. And the other key players include financial advisors, bond and disclosure counsel, trustees, and the rating agencies as well. Who issues municipal bonds? You can see in this chart, this is California debt issuance broken down by sector for a typical year. But the vast majority of it does go towards capital improvements and public works. So what is special about municipal bonds? And this is where the United States differs from any other place in the entire world. throughout the world, most infrastructure is financed through true public-private partnerships, like in Australia and Canada, all over Europe, as well as Latin America. They don't have what we have. And what is it that we have? It's tax exemption, okay? So if you own a municipal bond and it's a tax-exempt municipal bond, the interest that is earned on that municipal bond, you do not have to pay taxes on that to the federal government or to the state government. In a way, it's like it's a federal subsidy to local governments. Because of that, municipal issuers and municipal bonds typically have lower interest rates than they would their taxable counterparts, right? So because we as the owners of those municipal bonds don't have to remit that interest, we will say, okay, well we'll take a lower percentage on the interest. So local governments are able to issue debt at a lower interest cost. Now, during 2017 tax cut, municipal bonds were on the chopping block. Like the initial draft of it was, no, we're going to get rid of all tax exemption. That was very, 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 very scary. At the end of the day, they didn't get rid of tax exemption, which is great because I got 2 little kids at home. And at the end of the day, you know, local governments, this is how our system works in the United States. I will say that these days, in this crazy market that we have and this crazy interest rate, the vast majority of governments are issuing taxable debt because why not? Why have the restrictions that come with municipal tax-exempt municipal bonds when you can issue at taxable rates that are not that much higher than tax-exempt? Issuing tax-exempt, there are restrictions. You can't just issue debt and use that debt for private companies, right? There's private use, and there's all these restrictions that come along with municipal bonds, issuing tax-exempt municipal bonds that I won't bore you with. It's getting down into the details. But that's why having a tax lawyer and knowing the ins and outs of the tax code is critical when you issue municipal bonds. It is a federal subsidy, but you can't just use the money willy-nilly. There are very strict provisions when you do issue tax-exempt municipal bonds. Limitations: can just any state or local government just issue bonds? No, there's state constitutional debt limits that I mentioned before, and you have to meet one of the exemptions. Otherwise, you're going to have to go out and get a vote of the people. Here in California, the 3 major exceptions to the state debt limitation that have been recognized by the courts are the lease exception, which basically means, you know, if a government has the beneficial use and occupancy of a building, and they're occupying it, and they pay that rent, that's not a debt under California law. That's just a lease financing. Should something happen and they don't have occupancy or use of that structure, then that's called an abatement. And so long as the underlying documents say that that's not an event of default and you can't blame the government for that, then that's not a debt. The other exceptions are special funds. Those are basically revenue bonds. So if the repayment source of a bond is strictly tied to a specific revenue source, that's not considered a debt as well. And then there's obligations imposed by law, which hasn't really been tested by the courts, and nobody really uses that exception. What resources are used to repay bonds? If there's a dedicated taxes, those are usually property taxes, voter-approved additional sales taxes, parcel taxes, and the type of bonds that come out of the dedicated taxes are GO bonds, dedicated tax revenues, Mello-Roos. General fund is something that the state of California, that's their, even though they call them general obligation, it really comes out of the state's general fund. There's special fund bonds, which are like water and other utility fees. And then there's non-governmental activities. It's not just governments that get the benefit of municipal bonds. Universities, every university that's out there issues municipal bonds, and they do it on a tax-exempt basis. There's special provisions in the tax code that allow for nonprofits to also take advantage of the tax exemption. Hospitals, if it's a nonprofit hospital system, they're issuing municipal bonds. Schools, museums, anything that's a nonprofit and they have a lot of facilities, they also take advantage of municipal bonds. So when I really said that our entire society is built on the backbone of municipal bonds, I was serious. I'm not kidding. I'm like a godlike figure standing in front of you people. Most common in California is a lease revenue bond. This is fairly typical because, California's constitutional debt limitation. We don't want to go to get a vote of 2/3 vote of the people every single time we need to build something, or 55% if you want to build schools. Oops, I'm sorry. I went backwards. I don't know how I did that. Sorry about that. Financing transportation infrastructure. So this is primarily a transportation conference. So we'll focus more on how is our transportation financed. Gas taxes. Throughout the United States, one of the primary ways that we've been building out our roads and building out our transportation infrastructure is through the gas tax. Federal gas taxes have not been raised in about almost 30 years. California also has its own fuel taxes, which have been raised since 2017. I wanted to highlight more taxes there because that's going to be very relevant to one of my later slides. And here's the problem with fuel taxes. Do you know what's been happening over the last 20 or 30 years is our cars are becoming more fuel efficient. Okay, so the amount of gas that's being purchased is less. Also, the rollout of electrical vehicles. With electrical vehicles, they're not paying gas taxes. So that's why when you hear that our highway trust fund is bankrupt, it's because it is. It is bankrupt. And that highway trust fund is dispersed throughout the entire United States by the federal government, and it's just dwindling and dwindling and dwindling. It was never pegged to inflation. It hasn't been raised. Nobody in Congress wants to raise it because it's more taxes, and people in Congress are worried about getting reelected. So it's broken. That our primary method of financing infrastructure in our country, when we need it the most, when we do need to redo our infrastructure to take that next leap in transportation, is broken. And that's one of the reasons why we need to rethink how we finance. Additional transportation funding sources. So if our gas tax is broken, what else do we do in order to build out our infrastructure? One of the things that we have is here in California, we do sales tax measures, okay? So you may think that the trains that you ride throughout, BART and other types of local rail is paid for with when you go and you pay your fare box and you ride your train, you think, oh, this is going to finance the building of more of these trains. That's not true. When you go to the store and you buy something that's subject to a sales tax within a county, you're financing part of the infrastructure within your community. And that's not just you, that's anybody that's within your community buying anything and paying part of the sales tax, which is very high in the state of California. Problems with that? Well, you can see that one of the reasons why I'm saying things are looking salty is because this is another one of those slides where it's more taxes. When we keep raising taxes, there's going to be a revolt, and that's what I think actually occurred very recently, and I'll explain one of the reasons why. And then what will the long-term impact of the coronavirus be on tourism? If there's going to be less tourists, it's going to be less sales taxes. How is that going to affect things? It will affect things. We're just not sure yet because it's too soon. Other ways to build out transportation infrastructure, tolls. Usually for toll roads, the tolls that are paid are dedicated towards repaying the debt that was issued to build out those roads. Public-private partnerships, that's when a company will actually operate a toll road or operate a system, and they'll receive government payments as a part of running that system, or they'll take the revenue sources themselves. Voter-approved debt, like the bullet train. Back in 2008, that we approved up to $9 billion, almost $10 billion of bonds to be issued for the bullet train, although the price tag on that train is now over $100 billion, and yeah, I don't think if we knew that the price tag was going to be that big that we would have approved that, but we did approve it. There's also been talk about, and there's been some rollout of transitioning from the gas tax to vehicle mileage. So there's been tests in Oregon and in Washington to transition away from paying gas on a gas basis, but you're actually paying per mile. I'm a big advocate of rethinking going to a vehicle, going down that road of people paying by the amount that they drive, not that the gas that they consume. Because this way we can actually capture electric vehicles. This way we can get hybrid vehicles that are not paying that much gas. This way, everybody's paying their fair share for infrastructure. I'm a big believer in electrification. I'm a big advocate for it. If I do ever buy another car, it'll be an electric car. But I know that until we fix the way that we're financing our infrastructure to move away from the gas tax, I know I'm not paying my fair share of the roads that I'm driving on. And neither are you if you're driving an electric car. You're taking advantage and not being fair. Just want to point that out to you. Public-private partnerships. The way that these work is you have to have specific state legislation in order to bring in a private corporation to kind of take over a facility or road. There have been many examples of these, but not enough, in my opinion, and in a lot of other people's opinion. They're authorized currently for Caltrans, the judicial branch, the High-Speed Rail Authority, and local government agencies. Interestingly enough, I spoke on a panel a couple months ago, and throughout the United States and here in California, we're doing a lot of these public-private partnerships for courthouses. And that I find that shocking. I don't know why. I just feel like we could be doing more than just building courthouses with private corporations. It just doesn't seem like the best use. But those have been the most successful public-private partnerships. Like Long Beach Courthouse. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. That was a hugely successful public-private partnership. But and I guess that's a good test bed. But I just think that these need to be more expanded to get more private involvement. Some other P3 examples: State Route 91 down in Orange County. The express lanes, that had started off as a public-private partnership. That's now owned primarily by OCTA and RCTC. State Route 125 in San Diego, yeah, that went bankrupt, and then the federal government took it over. I actually represented the federal government in the bankruptcy, and a private corporation. They eventually sold that to Sandag, so Sandag now owns that toll road. Presidio Parkway in San Francisco, that's been very successful. As I mentioned, Long Beach Courthouse and Long Beach Civic Center are all P3s. Okay, the present and future problems facing California agencies. Why do I keep saying salty? Some of you may know this, okay, let me just ask a really quick question of the room. In 2018 and soon to be in 2019, who here around tax time wanted to jump off of a building? I'm surprised not all of your hands are, okay, I know suicide's not funny, but I'm serious when I say that the tax bills for the last 2 years have been atrocious. And here's the reason why. It's because the Tax Cut and Jobs Act capped at $10,000 the federal income tax deduction for state and local taxes, okay? So our property taxes, our state income taxes, we only get a deduction now up to $10,000. That's huge. That's one of the primary reasons. By the way, most people think that SALT cap was put into place to punish the blue states and I'm not trying to turn our country against each other, but if you really want to get down to the major difference between a red state, most of the red states and the blue states, it's this. Let me give you what I think is the primary example, the primary evidence of the difference between what happened before the 2017 Tax Cut Act and what happened after. So the Contra Costa County measure from 2016 was apparently voted down because it focused too much on cars, right? It focused too much. Voters wanted to have, more public transportation, more things other than cars. Okay, so you guys come out in 2020 and you do that. You refocus away from it, and it got voted down. I think the primary reason is because there's just too many taxes in California. You talk to local realtors. I do some real estate and investing, and talk to a lot of realtors, and they honestly say that many Californians are leaving. It's not the huge amount that I was predicting was going to occur. It wasn't a crisis. It wasn't the pandemic that I was predicting. If you search my name and search SALT, I'm quoted in a lot of articles. But it's happening. And a lot of people are moving to Nevada, and a lot of people are moving to Texas, and a lot of people are moving to Idaho and other places where taxes are lower. And I do think it's because of SALT. What does that mean for local governments? It's going to mean that when you do need to get voter-approved debt, it's going to be harder. It's going to continue to be harder. So that's why we need to think of other ways to finance our infrastructure, get more private companies involved, because you cannot rely on taxes anymore. And while this limit is in place, until the federal government fixes this big problem, which there is a measure in the House right now, which we all know is, just because the House approves something doesn't mean that the Senate's going to do anything. There's a measure, but I don't think it's going to change. I think this is the new reality. So local governments need to rethink this, and private corporations need to join together with local government. We need to work together to think about how we're going to finance and redo our infrastructure to take that next leap in transportation. That's what I advocate for. That's what I talk incessantly about, and that's one of the primary themes of my keynote today. The future of infrastructure finance, muni bonds are cost effective. They really are. We know what we're doing. The system, the muni bond system is not broken. It is a great, cheap way to finance. The problem is the limitations on government revenues and resources. We need more, in my opinion, we need more flexibility. I think we need to lower the voting thresholds. We need to drop them down from 2/3. Maybe I have been advocating for what was successful for school districts throughout California is when they've dropped the voting threshold from 2/3 to 55%. That's when we got our schools rebuilt throughout the state. I think we need to do that for transportation. That's something that I'm advocating for at the state level. Thank you. Thank you very much. Crowdfunding. I'm a big believer in it. I don't know if it works, but any company that says they want to do more crowdfunding for infrastructure, I talk to them and I give them as much free legal and whatever advice that I can, because I can't figure it out yet. And there has been companies that have tried to do this and they're now out of the business, but hopefully we can get more citizen involvement by lowering denominations, perhaps blockchain. There's some communities that think that blockchain, while the upfront costs of establishing a blockchain system are going to be very difficult, I think over the long run, that could make borrowing cheaper. P3s, we need to make sure that any legislation that's expiring, that it gets renewed and expanded. I think we do need to expand P3s legislatively and provide more for it. So that'll be another get more private activity involvement. You want to know what a bad idea is? A bad idea is using marijuana taxes. Let's just use all those taxes that we're going to get from marijuana. Let's use that for our infrastructure. I could tell you this. There's another group of people that are leaving the state of California. Cannabis growers. The taxes are killing them. States like Oklahoma, shockingly, ever since they passed their medical marijuana measure, are attracting California growers and California businesses because the taxes are too high here. The illicit market of cannabis is booming right now because the taxes are so high. So I don't want local governments to think, we'll just use that marijuana tax. It is not going to work. You're going to kill an industry that is still growing and does need to be regulated. And it's honestly collapsing. So I don't want that to be the thinking that's going to be the solution that everybody thought it was going to be when we legalized it in 2016.
Okay, the future. Will coronavirus have a long-term impact? Well, the immediate impact are going to be on our airports, hotels, our transit occupancy taxes, and sales taxes. Is this just temporary, or do local governments need to budget for less tourists and less sales taxes? I think you might. I don't know. Now, I don't want to end this on a downer, but if you haven't been watching what's been going on in Italy, then you're probably a happy person right now. If you want to get depressed and not want to leave your house, then go turn on the news and see what's going on in Italy. Otherwise, I would say avoid it. Public transportation. Transit ridership was already trending down. In one of my Forbes articles, I talked about that, and I explained that the affordable housing crisis is one of the reasons why transit ridership was down, because all of these transit-oriented developments drove rents up in these transit areas, and the commuters that were already using that transit can no longer afford to live in that area. So transit-oriented development actually has a negative impact on transit ridership. So it was already trending down, and will coronavirus be a nuclear bomb? And if people stop using public transit, are they going to be willing to finance it? I don't know, but it's an issue. Future impact on sales tax measures for transit. Yeah, if less and less people use it, then they're probably going to be less likely to vote for it. Ride sharing, is the coronavirus going to be good or bad? You have the Uber CEO initially said that there was a drop in their revenues because of a drop in people at the airports, but it has been good for Uber Eats. Lyft, their CEO says, nope, this has been great. We've actually seen an uptick. Our revenues are rising because of this, because of a drop in transit ridership. Will this be good for driverless personal vehicles? I personally am against the expansion and cult-like addiction that we have on personal vehicles in the United States. But I fear that that most people are going to use this to their advantage and advocate for more roads and less transportation. So I'm not feeling particularly good about this right now, but there's hope. I do think that we'll get through this. We've been through a lot as a society. There's going to be some pain points. The movement can't be turned around. The explosion of micromobility, the more young people wanting to not use their own cars, senior citizens actually senior people moving back to cities because they want to use transportation, they want to walk more. I don't think that tide is going to change by something like the coronavirus. I just want local governments to be cautious right now. This is a time to be kind of mindful of the realities that are currently setting in, and thinking about it when they're going to budget, and they're thinking about when they're going to build out their infrastructure, because stuff like this can happen. So we all need contingency plans. That's the end of my presentation, but I will take any types of questions if you have any. I'm open to anything that you would like to discuss. Yes, thank you, because I would have felt really bad if I didn't get one question. I would have felt like I just shocked the room.
Do you think that a state like California can keep up with the transportation needs and with the uptick all of our roads are getting older and we're building more of them. Can we even keep up?
It'll all come down to whether or not we can pay for it. And I really am worried about salt. I have been, and I continue to be worried about it. I do think that a lot of Californians are done. They're done with the raising of taxes. They're hearing from their friends and family that have left the state and moved to other places, and their cost of living has dropped. So if we're solely going to rely upon taxes to build everything, then I don't think it's going to happen. We need more private involvement. The private corporations and the government need to talk. They need to sit in a room, and they need to talk about infrastructure finance. They need to hire me to go in there and give presentations and educate them about how has this stuff been built in the past, how can we legally work with you, governments, and within the constitutional framework to be partners with you. Private corporations just assume that the roads are going to be there. They assume that the transit's just going to continue to be built, and then we could just put scooters to be the first mile, last mile solution. They just assume that's going to be there because it's there now. Does that mean that it's always going to be properly maintained and people are going to use it? No, I don't think so. I'm a big advocate for getting the government and the private corporations in a room and talking about quote unquote boring stuff like infrastructure finance. I can make it entertaining. There's plenty of ways I can make it entertaining. That's why I've taken stand-up comedy classes and acting classes. I'm trying to make infrastructure sexy and fun to talk about. So there is hope, but I'm the hope. Yes?
With a P3, there's something in it for the private company, and normally it's something like a revenue stream.
Correct.
So if there's a revenue stream, then why couldn't a local government use a revenue bond? What's the advantage of a P3 over, say, something like a revenue bond?
Okay, so one of the reasons why P3s are used is because there is this perception that private corporations can build it faster, better, and cheaper. There is that perception. I don't necessarily know if that's 100% true, but why not give it a try? And local governments, some people think that local governments shouldn't be in the business of operating anything and everything within their realm. If there is most things are financed with a revenue stream. Bringing in more private companies is going to be better overall because it'll smooth out the. It's not smooth. I'm trying to think of why. Like the best reason why, if there is a revenue stream, why wouldn't the local government just do it? There's efficiencies that come along with private corporations that most people think they can just do better. Now, I don't necessarily know that's true, so I advocate for more P3s because I'd like to see if they could do better. Because if they can do better, then we should have more of those. Does that make any sense? I'd like to see other options than just governments running and financing everything. Because it's worked in other countries as well. There was one other question. Yes.
So you would think that a P3 would be a step before completely privatizing busy traffic areas so that 880 could eventually become Bezos Freeway or could be LeBron Freeway?
Freeways are that's pretty. I mean, it wouldn't be a freeway, right? It'd be a toll road because they're not gonna put their name brand on it unless they're gonna convert that to some kind of revenue stream back to them. I'm not necessarily advocating for P3s to replace muni bonds. Remember, I have 2 little kids at home. I still need a job. I'm just saying we need other options because the revenue sources that are going to local governments, the way they're primarily funding everything through taxes, there are limitations that are placed on them. So we need more private involvement to kind of spread the running of our society around. That's what I'm advocating for. I do think we need to get private companies to get more involved to actually pay more. I want to see private companies pay more for infrastructure. I'm a big believer in that, and I think they need to work hand in hand with local governments. I don't want full replacement. I want them to work with local governments and figure out how we can rebuild our infrastructure together where that benefits private companies that are putting these cars out on the road and putting this technology out there. It's for the benefit of everyone. Thank you.